Start when I turn on the microphone. Good evening. Somebody please give me a wave when that first bell goes off, because I did not even hear it last week, and when I heard the second bell, I thought it was the first bell, and I got myself in trouble. So
Volunteers tribute.
Okay. Because I get to think about what I'm going to say and look at what I'm going to say, and I completely zone out hearing that bell, I guess. I don't know. Let's begin class with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for your many blessings. We thank you for this evening that we can gather together. We thank you for the moisture we're receiving. Some places more than others. Some places it's causing damage, and we'd ask you to be with those that are dealing with that. But we're thankful for the moisture that we have here, and the snow and the rain, and for the goodness that it will bring later. We'd ask you, Father, to be with us during our class as we look at Christians through the ages and see the issues and the problems they had, and also the victories that they had, that we may learn from those and that we can better serve you because of it. In your Son's name we pray. Amen. Okay. I'm not going to do a lot of review this week, because last week was kind of the boring stuff anyway, so I don't want to spend a lot of time reviewing it. So we're up to emperor worship in talking about the different religions that Christianity came into and that Jesus came into. And emperor worship, you can even argue that it's not really worship, but it also was worship. The concentration of power within the Roman emperor, you had one man that was vested with this unprecedented power, and the Senate actually gave him a divine appointment. It wasn't later till Domitian that he was the first one to attempt to compel his servants, or his subjects, to worship him. But Julius Caesar was the first Caesar, that the Senate gave deity to. Julius Caesar was the adopted son, or not Julius, Augustus Caesar was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was actually his great uncle, but he had adopted him. Julius Caesar gave him all of his training, Augustus that is. He trained him in the politics of things by taking him to stuff in Rome and introducing him to people. He took him on campaigns, so he introduced him to the military life. He took him on victory tours, after his, legions conquered places and so forth. So Augustus Caesar was arguably the greatest of the Caesars, of all the Caesars. There were 4 or 5 Caesars after him from his family. He was the one that began what was known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace that lasted roughly 2 centuries. He was, what else could I say about Augustus Caesar? His real name was Octavian. He was born in 63 BC. He died in 14 AD. He became the emperor in 27 AD. And he really was, the month of August is named after Augustus Caesar. We probably are happy that they named the month for him, because the Latin name for that month before him was Sextilius. So imagine being born in Sextilius. The month of July is named after Julius Caesar, and that month before Julius was Quintilis. So we'd have Quintilis and Sextilis, as our months in the summer, if it wasn't for July and August for Julius and Augustus. So anyway, has nothing to do with church history, but I just had to kind of throw that in. He had lots of titles. He was called the Pontifex Maximus. He never referred to himself as any of these. He was actually, for all of his power, he was a very modest man. The Roman Empire doubled in size during his reign, and his reign was just 27 BC to 14 AD, so that's 41 years, but it doubled in size during his reign. His titles were Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, is what that means. Princeps, which is first citizen of the Roman Empire. Imperator, commander-in-chief. Divi Filius, son of a god. And that was following the deification that the Senate gave to him. But he never took that to heart, and neither did a lot of the other Caesars until Domitian, who actually started believing that he was a god when the Senate appointed him as a god, and he required his subjects to worship him. But you can see that was not a worship that the citizens really were doing in their hearts. So emperor worship, it's one of the keys in the persecution of Christians, because the Romans, who saw no problem with adding another god to their list, could not understand why the Christians steadfastly refused to worship a man. In fact, they looked upon this refusal as unpatriotic and disrespectful to the emperor, and it caused a lot of persecution to the Christians consequently. So, basically Rome was polytheistic, and for the most part, the only monotheistic people were the Jews and the Christians. But the Romans and the Greeks were polytheistic. And since there's no middle ground between these two, whether you worship the emperor or whether you don't, the Christians suffered. By the end of the first century under Domitian's reign, refusal to worship the emperor resulted in painful and torturous death, and we'll get into that in a later lesson. So then, after emperor worship, another type of worship that was cultic, it was, cults were doing this, was the mystery religions. It's hard to say a lot about the mystery religions because they were mysterious. Part of that being mysterious was the fact that they kind of kept things a mystery and didn't reveal a lot of stuff. But you had the state religions, with the Greeks. You had the emperor worship with the Romans. Those were ritualistic, and they sought protection from the gods. These did not offer much personal comfort, no solace, or so that gave rise to the mystery religions. And so a lot of people adopted them. They had Eastern origins. They came out of Asia and Egypt and Persia. And those were areas that Augustus, and that's why I spent some time on him, he conquered a lot of those areas and brought these mystery religions back into Rome and back into the Roman Empire. He conquered Egypt. After Julius Caesar died, there were, for a short period of time, they carved up the Roman Empire between three different people. And one of them was Augustus Caesar, one of them was Marcus somebody, and then another one was Mark Antony. And we all know who Mark Antony was if you watched any of the old movies, but Mark Antony, took Cleopatra, and he had gone to Egypt, and they came and actually brought the Egyptian fleet and Mark Antony's armies, his third of the armies to fight against, to come to Rome. And he, I'm getting into too much history here that's not church history, but Augustus Caesar blockaded them, off an island in Greece, and most of his army deserted him. Mark Antony and Cleopatra then returned on their big barge of a ship back to Egypt, and they committed suicide. So then, consequently, he took over Egypt. He took over Persia when he went to the east, and so forth. So there were lots of these areas, and these mystery religions came out of those places, Egypt and Asia and Persia. While they differed greatly in detail, and I'm not going to go into a lot of the different ones, they were alike in certain broad characteristics. Oh, and that, I was going to change the color of those A, B, and C. That first one is an A. They're centered on a God who died and came back to life. Okay. That's going to sound vaguely familiar to you. Each had rituals and formulas that illustrated how the God had returned to life. The initiate was inducted into the experience and was rendered immortal. Initiations were not unlike those of various secret societies today. Think of some of your fraternities. I don't belong to any of those, but your Masons or I won't name names, but I guess I just did name one name, but I won't name any more names. And then the third one, believers were equal socially. These religions made the religious experience emphatically personal, whereas the worship of the Greek gods and the Roman gods and the emperor worship, that was not personal at all. But these mystery religions were personal. Nothing of them is said directly in the New Testament, but they were in existence. Now then, so I want to read you something out of this little church history book. I've got a shelf full of church history books at home. Gonzalez wrote a 2-volume set that's great. Williston Walker was the one I read 50 years ago when I was in college. This one is written by a member of the church. It's written by F.W. Maddox, and then there's John McCrae revised it. But it was written back in 1961. This is written by a member of the church. If you were to have one church history book in your library, I'd recommend this one. It's called The Eternal Kingdom. It takes the Church of Christ perspective on church history. Both of these men that that wrote this were teachers or professors at Harding. He used the paper edition. Well, this is paperback. Before it was published, he used his notes to teach his class at Harding. It was so popular, most of the churches around Arkansas would teach a church history class and use his notes. And they finally, with the encouragement of George Benson, who was the president of Harding at the time, they published it into a book. And so a lot of people have this book. Every once in a while, I'll find a copy, at a used bookstore someplace, and I'll pick one up so I can give it away to somebody. But I've given all mine away. I've only got 2 volumes, but this one has all my notes in it, and my other one's my only hardback copy. So I wanted to keep it too, to have a hardback copy. But so I give them away about as quick as I come across them, and you don't come across them very often. But it's got some information in here about what I've just said. These mystery religions sound familiar to us, but there are some distinct differences between them and between Christianity. First of all, when you're talking about Roman religion, in general, it can be said that outside of Judaism, and you can consider Christianity as a descendant, so to speak, of Judaism. Outside of Judaism, there was no conscious, and now I'm reading from here, no conscious relationship of religion and morality. A person could be very religious and very immoral at the same time. We find that hard to believe, but back then you could. For the pagan religions did nothing to promote personal purity or social improvement. Outside of Judaism, there was no voice raised against the mass slaughter of gladiators at the time. Under Trajan, there was one gladiatorial game where there were 10,000 gladiators in a single game. So you can imagine the carnage at that game. There were some of the Colosseums where they had the gladiatorial games where they would actually flood the floor of the Colosseum and put boats out there, and they would have naval battles because it was just to entertain people with carnage and violence and death. But there was no voice raised against that. It was all done in the name of sport. There was no voice raised against the exposure of infants. It was considered perfectly fine if you had a daughter for a child to expose them. What that means is you left them out in the elements and let them just die on their own. Actually, there was a business that rose out of that. There were some professionals that actually would go around to the trash heaps and collect these little infants. It didn't have to always be a girl. Sometimes it could be a smaller boy or something. They would collect them up and raise them and sell them into slavery, like they were a crop. Okay, that's the way society was back then that wasn't Jewish or Christian. There was no rules against abortion. There were no, brothels were widespread. So public immorality, sometimes even in the name of the pagan gods, was something that went on. Okay. So even within these mystery religions, you had that kind of immorality going on. So when you try to compare that to Christianity, that is a major difference. But Christianity is a religion based on historical fact. These mystery religions were based on myth. The pagans had their myths, but the Christians had their facts. The miracles and resurrections of Christ were first preached and had their greatest influence in the very location where they took place. The truth of Christianity does not rest upon its philosophical aspects, but rather upon the death and resurrection of Christ, and these facts were open to public investigation. I'm reading from his book here. A second point, the pagans had no concept of guilt in the Christian sense, or of God's forgiving and cleansing sin through a divine sacrifice. That's absent from those mystery religions. Since these ideas constitute the very heart of Christianity, the pagan religions cannot be said to have produced Christianity. Christians were not only conscious of it. I've started taking a medicine that gives me dry mouth. I apologize. Sometimes my tongue sticks to the top of my mouth. Christians were not only conscious of a great difference between themselves and others, but also stood against all other religions with an uncompromising opposition. This very exclusiveness was the cause of persecution. Since the pagan ideas were readily accepted into Roman society, it's not conceivable to think that Christianity was the offspring of paganism and yet refused to recognize that relationship, because it would have stopped the persecution if they had accepted that and recognized it. Number 4, if Christianity were the offspring of pagan religions, how does one account for its strength under persecution and its final victory over the pagan cults? Because they are no longer, after about the 2nd century, they disappeared. Christianity is still alive today. And 5, no Christian ever referred to paganism as the source of his ideas. Christ crucified was to the pagans foolishness, but to the Christian, the hope of glory. Between the atoning death of Christ, his bodily resurrection and ascension on the one hand, and the pagan superstitious idolatry on the other, the gulf is fixed that no man can cross. I thought he said it better than I could say, and if I tried to summarize it, I would mess it up. But I think this is very important, because when you look at the major tenets of the mystery religions, you go, man, on the surface, that sounds a lot like Christianity. Maybe that's where we came from. No, it's not. Not in the least. And that's why I want to spend a few minutes pointing out the differences between, how Christianity began and what they taught. There's the similarities are only on the surface. Okay. So you can look through the Old Testament, you can look through the New Testament, you can see that the Jews were often more interested in magic than were the Gentiles. They did have some interest in it. Horoscope study came from the Persians, like I was talking about, the things that came, through Augustus Caesar. The Babylonian captivity brought the Jews into contact with the magic lore of the East. So they already had it from when they were in Babylon and then returned. Christianity considered magic as pagan and extremely dangerous. So the Jews had an interest in the magic, and you can kind of see that in the Old Testament and some of the things that went on with, Saul consulting different witches and so forth. Christianity considered magic as pagan and extremely dangerous. The power that was demonstrated by Christ and his apostles was fascinating to those who believed in the occult. Some of their magic incantations were a curious combination of pagan, Jewish, and Christian phrases that saw the power but did not recognize its depth. And I'm going to make another reading right here. This is from the book by Merrill Tenney. It's another book from the 60s. I'm dating myself here, I know, but it's a book from the 60s. This is the Revised New Testament Survey. The first one was New Testament, Survey and Organization of the Church or something like that. But this is his book. And Adam, I had to go online and find this. I never did find my original copy of it. There he is. Anywhere, but when I left Weiser, I had Adam come over. I have about 2,000 books in my library. I said, take whatever you want, because I don't think I'm going to be teaching anymore. I was going to come here and put my feet up and just relax and maybe, come to worship on Sunday and Wednesday night and and so forth. I wasn't planning on doing any teaching. So Adam just kind of cherry picked through all my books. And so I really thought that he had taken this book, but he looked and he couldn't find it either. So I don't know where my copy went to, but my industrious wife for $7, including shipping, found this book, and it came yesterday. So there's a section in here about mystery religions and then about worship of the occult. And there's a gentleman that Merrill Tenney quotes in here, George Milligan, in his selections from the Greek papyri, which is from Cambridge University Press. And I'm going to read that quote in a minute, but I want to show you that Jewish interest in magic, I'm reading from Merrill Tenney's book. Jewish interest in magic appears in the New Testament. The Pharisees cast out demons and sorcerers, and that's mentioned in Acts as a rival to the preachers of the gospel. That's Acts chapter 8 and Acts chapter 13. The pagan magic was recognized as hostile to Christianity by the Ephesian Christians who burned their books of spells in a bonfire. And the estimated value of those books was 50,000 pieces of silver. That's Acts 19:19. The biblical attitude towards occult worship, however, was invariably hostile. Although the reality of demonic forces was recognized, commerce with them was strictly forbidden both in the Old and the New Testaments. And I won't read those verses, but it's in Deuteronomy and Micah and 1 Corinthians. Specimens of magic formulas that were used to control the spirits or to bring good luck appear in the papyri. And I'm going to read a quote from one of those papyruses in a minute here. One of these, an excerpt from the Great Paris Magical Papyrus of the 3rd century, will show the curious combination of pagan, Jewish, and Christian phraseology which was used as a charm for exorcising a demon. Now, they use a lot of Jewish and Christian names, but these men are not Christians, nor are they Jews. But they figure if we throw enough of these names in here, maybe this demon will leave this person, or we're going to have some good luck with what we're doing. So now this is a quote from a papyri, but it's an English translation. And the papyri is not just the incantation, but it's the explanation to the magician that's going to deliver the incantation of how to do that. So this is the quote. A notable spell for driving out demons. Invocation to be uttered over the head of the possessed one. Place before him branches of olive, and standing behind him say, Hail, Spirit of Abraham! Hail, Spirit of Isaac! Hail, Spirit of Jacob! Jesus the Christ, the Holy One, the Spirit. Here follows a series of apparently meaningless words, in other words, mumbo jumbo. Drive forth the demon from the man until the unclean demon of Satan shall flee before thee. I adjure thee, O demon, whoever thou art, by the God, and I'm going to mangle these Latin words, Sarbarbarbathioth, Sarbarbarbathiuth, Sarbarbarbathoneth, and Sarbarbarbaphai. Come forth, O demon, whoever thou art, and depart from so-and-so at once. At once, now. Come forth, O demon, for I shall chain thee with adamantine chains, not to be loosed, and I shall give you over to black chaos in utter destruction. Okay, now that's these worshipers of the occult that are trying to use the Jewish and the Christian phraseology to add some weight to their formula. So that's the end of that papyri. But the foregoing formula illustrates both the respect of the pagan world for the power of the gospel of Christ and also its misconception of the gospel. Had there been no real power in Christianity against the demonic influences of paganism, the names of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jesus would never have been used at all. This misconception lay in taking for granted that these terms made just one more magical charm to be used at the convenience of the exorcist. The user of this formula was repeating the error of who in Acts tried to do the same thing. Simon the sorcerer, Simon Magus, Simon the magician, whatever you want to call him, Simon. They're trying to do the same thing that Simon was trying to do, who thought that the power of God could be bought with money. Such a mixture of faith and superstition was by no means uncommon among a people who were intensely religious in nature, but who had no access to regular teaching or to a written copy of the scriptures. And that's fixing to change as we get into the 2nd and 3rd century. Okay. That's about all the readings I'm going to do for tonight. So you can rest easy now for the next 15 minutes. So next you got astrology. And I'm not going to say a lot about astrology because it never really infiltrated Christianity. And it was rejected by them. It came again from Babylon and Persia. It was very popular in the 1st century, but Christianity never had a problem with it coming into. And astrology, there's astrology and astronomy. It's two different things. One's a science, one's a well, I'm going to offend somebody if I say too much about astrology, but astrology is horoscopes, okay? Horoscopes. Astronomy is a science, the study of the stars and the planets and the comets. And for instance, I had in my notes, if we had gotten this far last week, last Wednesday, the day before on Tuesday, was the perihelion. That's an astronomy term, not an astrology term. Anybody know what the perihelion is? Helios is Latin for sun. Perihelion is the day that the earth comes the closest to the sun. It was actually January 3rd this year. Okay? For those of you that don't know, and I'm getting off my topic, but astronomy, it's the study of the stars and the planets and everything. The earth spins on 24-hour cycles, give or take a fraction of a second, hence leap year. And then, in addition to spinning, it also circles the sun, but not in a perfect circle. It's in an elliptical circle. And so there's times when it's farther from the sun and times when it's nearer to the sun. And the time of the year when it was nearest to the sun this year was last Tuesday. Okay, let's get on to class. Philosophies. These were attempts to correlate all existing knowledge into systematic forms and integrate that into human experience. Not necessarily religion, but just it was logical men trying to think logically and trying to give people a logical framework to operate with. And these were attempts of intelligent and thoughtful men who were not satisfied with idol worship or stargazing and the like. The logic was devised. Many basic beliefs prevail even today. Or you wouldn't, if they didn't prevail today, you wouldn't have in our universities a degree called philosophy. You can take philosophy classes. You can get a doctor's degree of philosophy. So they have prevailed. Some of the philosophies were later absorbed into the thought of the church, and as we see those through the centuries, we'll try and bring some of those to light. Some of those philosophers were Plato. The real world exists as a world of ideals. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. Each of these, would have a week in a philosophy class. I'm just going to give you thumbnails on each of these. But, a world of ideals, which the material world is only a shadow. The ultimate good then is knowledge. Man's goal then is to increase his knowledge until he crosses from the material world into the ideal world. So you did that with reflection and meditation and asceticism that enabled one to approach the ideal. Now, when I say Christianity took some of these ideas, into itself, asceticism was one of those. The followers of Plato believed that you had to deny self, if you were going to cross over into the ideal, and so you had to live this ascetic life. You had monks that lived ascetic lives. They denied themselves all kinds of things, anyway. Another kind is Gnosticism. You see, I wrote a whole lot about that. It's basically, this secret knowledge that was available that led to salvation. It was a derivative of Plato. Again, it also had a dualism in the ideal world and the real world. But in that, the body is evil and you have to be strictly curbed However, since the body's only, here's their rationale. Since the body, the body has to be curbed, but on the other hand, since the body's only temporary, its acts were inconsequential and gratification of its desires were of no consequence. So if you wanted to gratify those desires, go ahead. They weren't ascetics like the followers of Plato. The human spirit was the only real part of a man. Not the body, but just the spirit. And then you had the Neoplatonisms and the only reason I mention this one is to contrast it to Christians. They went even beyond Plato in the degree by teaching the attainment of spiritual life could not be reached by intellectual effort, by a mystical absorption into the infinite. And the body was totally evil. So being absorbed into the infinite, that sounds like a Christian, dying and going to heaven. But it's totally the opposite, because the body was totally evil, it was incomprehensible to them to think that God would send his son to earth as a man, because that would put him in bodily form. No God would do that. So they completely rejected Christianity because of that. Then you got the Epicureanism. They saw no purpose in the world or universe. Everything was by chance. The greatest good was the absence of any pain or the absence of any dissatisfaction. So you can imagine they just, Garfield was probably an Epicurean. I don't know if you know Garfield's model. I've quoted it before, but, Garfield says, life is short, eat dessert first. That's kind of an Epicurean. If it's going to make you dissatisfied to eat your broccoli before your ice cream, go ahead, eat the ice cream, forget the broccoli. Things to be done were those that brought the longest and fullest satisfaction to the individual. So there was, in this philosophy, there's no abstract reasoning, there's no creator, no concept of sin, no question of immorality. Everything is acceptable, Since the body was composed only of atoms with no purpose, that meant there's no soul and no afterlife. So, and yet Epicureanism and the next one, Stoics, are both, oops, I went the wrong way. And Stoics are both mentioned in Acts chapter 17, verse 18. The Christians talk against those. The Stoicism was founded by Zeno of Cyprus. They recognize no personal God, but ascribe to an absolute reason and a concept of fate. Conformity to reason is the highest goal. Personal feeling or emotion is harmful. Nature is as it should be. What will be, will be. Josephus, in his writings, said the Pharisees are a lot like the Stoics. The universe was to be accepted as it is. What will be, will be. That fostered a fairly high interest. I'll skip that. Therefore, the thought that God would love the world so much that he sent his son to die for mankind, was utterly unthinkable to the Stoic. When I think of Stoics, I think of, I don't know if any of you ever watched Star Trek when it was on, all those Star Trek shows. The Vulcans were very similar to the Stoics. No emotion, no feeling, it was all reason. And that's kind of what Zeno taught. But all of these philosophies were popular to various groups of learned men in the first century, but not to the ordinary man. The ordinary guy that was a slave or was working in the market or was raising a family or was out on a farm or, made chariot wheels, whatever. None of them followed any of these philosophies. These philosophies were just for the guys that sat in the universities of Aristotle and Plato and just thought about these higher things. And that's about the only people that they affected. Okay? Their abstraction made them impersonal, hard to come to grips with, and offered no final solution to anything. Okay? So that brings us now to Judaism. And I've got all of 6 minutes. Okay. Judaism was unique among the existing religions of the region. It was a national religion, but it had proselytes from all over. You could become a follower of the Hebrew religion by becoming circumcised and going through different things and so forth, and you could become a proselyte. It was exclusively monotheistic, which made it unique from all these other things that I've mentioned, and it did not allow to even admit the existence of other gods. There was only one true God, no other gods. Judaism was based on revelation. Oh, I thought it went off at 9:40. I still have 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. That's the first bell, right, Adam? Judaism was based, my life flashed there when I thought that was the second bell. Judaism was based on revelation for Jehovah God. It recorded in the scriptures, what was believed to be truth. It overshadowed and swept aside all other truth. I hesitated putting that all in caps, but it's not real truth, but it's all these other truths combined into that one truth, and it swept those all aside with what they taught. The Jewish temple played a central part in the Jewish religion. At this point, I want to point out Charles is doing an excellent job on Sunday morning, and I've stepped on his toes a couple of times because I went back into the period that he's covering in this period between the Testaments, and I did mention that the temple was destroyed twice. I did not mean to imply, and I went back and listened, and I don't know whether I did or not, but I may have very well implied that it was destroyed twice before Jesus came, but it wasn't. It was just destroyed once by the Babylonians. The second destruction was in 70 AD. But after that first destruction by the Babylonians, that led to the beginning of the synagogue worship, and using the synagogues for their worship. But its ethical teachings were inherent in the nature of its worship and were rigidly enforced. Other religions were largely traditions or mystic initiations. I got ahead of myself. Synagogues were established during the Babylonian captivity, and the practices carried over even after they returned to Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple. They still had their synagogue worship. Many Jews attended the synagogue without going to the temple once it was rebuilt. Synagogues were kind of like community churches, okay? They were geographically oriented. One of the largest synagogues around was in Alexandria in Egypt, because there was a large community of Jews there. And they even, I think, at one point, as Charles pointed out, built a temple there so they wouldn't have to come back to Palestine. Although the scriptures were still the core of Jewish belief, many oral traditions had begun during the captivity and other times during the turbulent Jewish history. So, somebody made a comment in Charles's class Sunday asking about the, what was it they were asking about, the Torah? Or the Septuagint. It was the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Hebrew Bible, the Aramaic Hebrew Bible translated into Greek. The Vulgate is the Old and New Testament Bible translated into Latin. So the Vulgate and the Septuagint, by definition, are just definitions of it being translated into different languages. But the written scripture was the Torah. The Torah was, another word for Torah was Pentateuch, the first 5 books. So the Torah was Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then you also had I wish Charles was here because he could probably help me with pronunciation. Tanakh in Hebrew is Tanakh, I think. No, I'm not speaking Klingon. Tanakh, which is only 24 books. How many books? We don't have any of our little kids in. How many books are in the Old Testament? 39. Why did the Hebrews have 24? Combinations, thank you. In other words, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, the Torah, also called, when you're talking about the whole Hebrew Bible, which was the Tanakh. The first 5 books were Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then you had the 8 books of the prophets. So that's 5 and 8. Somebody keep track with me here. That's how many? 13 so far? Okay, the 8 books of the prophets were Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Notice I didn't say first and second. Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then one book was called the 12 Minor Prophets. So Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Rebecca, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi were all in one book. 12 prophets, okay? So that cuts 12 books off right there. And then the 11 books of the writing, the Kesavim, that was Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, and they combined Ezra and Nehemiah. And they combined Chronicles in that section also. So when you don't have a Second Chronicles, a Second Kings, a Second Samuel, when you take 12 prophets and you add those together, that's 11 extras. So 11 and 3 is 14. And Ezra and Nehemiah together is 15. 15 to 24 is 39. Thank you. Okay, so that was the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. Now then, so that was their written word. But then you had the oral tradition. And the oral tradition was the Mishnah. The Mishnah was the oral tradition. And then the rabbis or the rabbinic, guys, give me 30 seconds. The rabbinic commentary on the oral tradition was the Gemara. The Gemara, the Mishnah together was the Talmud. So the Talmud was all of that oral tradition and the commentary on the oral tradition combined. So when you hear the Talmud, that's the oral tradition. And if you see one in a library, it's like a set of encyclopedias, like 18 volumes. 18 volumes, like this thick volumes. Now they put it on a little thumb drive. But anyway, I will stop there. Thank you for your attention. Anybody have a short question that I can write down and answer next week? Okay, good. Thank you very much for your time and your patience. I hope we gained something from this.